For most of my adult life, I believed stability meant happiness. I had a home, a husband, and a teenage son who was growing faster than I could keep up with. From the outside, everything about my life looked settled and respectable. There were no loud arguments in our house, no dramatic betrayals, no chaos that neighbors could whisper about. Just routine. Predictable, quiet routine that my husband and I had been married for nearly 2 decades. In the beginning, our relationship was full of energy. We stayed up late talking about plans for the future, dreaming about the kind of life we wanted to build together. Back then, even the smallest moments felt exciting: grocery shopping together, watching movies on the couch, laughing at things that probably weren't even that funny, but somewhere along the way, life shifted. It didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, almost invisible at first. Responsibilities replaced excitement. Work schedules became more important than shared dinners. Conversations became shorter, practical, and focused on things that needed to be handled. My husband worked hard. I never doubted that. He spent long hours focused on his career, always determined to provide for the family. And I respected that. I truly did. But over time, the distance between us started growing quietly. Not physical distance. We lived in the same house, slept in the same bed, but emotional distance. There were nights when he would come home late, exhausted, barely saying more than a few sentences before heading to bed. Other evenings he would sit in the living room scrolling through his phone while I cleaned the kitchen or finished small chores around the house. We rarely argued, but we also rarely talked about anything meaningful anymore. Sometimes I wondered if this was simply what long marriages became. Maybe passion was only meant for the early years. Maybe stability always replaced excitement eventually. I told myself this was normal, that every couple probably reached this point if they stayed together long enough. Our son, Daniel, was 15 at the time. Like most teenagers, he was slowly building his own world outside of the family. Friends, school activities, weekend plans. I understood that it was part of growing up, but I couldn't ignore the quiet feeling that my role in his life was changing too. When he was younger, he used to tell me everything. Every small story from school, every funny thing that happened with his classmates. Now our conversations were shorter, usually about homework, dinner, or reminding him to finish chores. The house felt different than it used to. Quieter in a strange way, even when everyone was technically there. It was around that time that one of Daniel's friends started coming over more often. His name was Ryan. At first, he was just another teenager walking through the front door, greeting me politely before heading upstairs to Daniel's room. I didn't think much about it. Teenagers hanging out together was the most normal thing in the world. Ryan was respectful, which I appreciated. Some of Daniel's other friends barely acknowledged adults when they visited, but Ryan always said hello. Sometimes he would help carry groceries inside if he happened to arrive while I was unloading the car. Small gestures like that stood out. Over time, I began noticing him more simply because he was around so often. The boys would spend hours playing games, watching movies, or working on school projects. Their laughter echoed through the hallway, filling the house with a kind of energy that had been missing for a while. Occasionally they would come downstairs looking for snacks or drinks. During those moments, Ryan would sometimes start casual conversations with me while Daniel searched the refrigerator. Simple things at first: questions about cooking, comments about music playing in the kitchen, jokes about how messy teenage bedrooms always seemed to be. It was harmless. At least that's what it felt like in the beginning. That I saw him the way any adult sees their child's friend. Just a kid who spent a lot of time in our house. Someone passing through on the way to adulthood, but there was something about his personality that stood out. He had an easy way of talking to people, a kind of natural friendliness that made conversations flow without effort. When he spoke, he actually listened to the response instead of immediately looking back at his phone like many teenagers did. One afternoon stands out clearly in my memory. Daniel had run upstairs to grab something he forgot for school while Ryan waited near the kitchen counter. We started talking about school subjects, and he mentioned that he enjoyed literature but struggled with certain assignments. That I offered a few suggestions, nothing unusual. Just advice any adult might give. But what caught me off guard was the way he responded. He seemed genuinely interested in what I was saying, asking follow-up questions, nodding thoughtfully. That it had been a long time since someone looked at me with that kind of attention during a conversation. When Daniel returned a minute later, the moment ended naturally. They grabbed their backpacks and rushed out the door, leaving the house quiet again. That I didn't think much about it at the time. It was just a brief interaction in an ordinary day, but as weeks passed, Ryan continued visiting regularly. Sometimes 3 or 4 times a week. Gradually, our short conversations became more common whenever the boys came downstairs. That I started noticing little things. The way he joked easily. The way he spoke about future plans with excitement. The kind of youthful optimism that adults slowly forget they once had. His presence brought a different energy into the house. A lighter atmosphere, and I realized something that made me slightly uncomfortable. That on days when I knew Daniel planned to bring friends over, the house felt less empty. Less quiet, more alive. That I tried not to think too deeply about that feeling. After all, it was natural to enjoy having lively people around. Anyone would feel the same way, but deep down, a small thought began forming in the back of my mind. For reasons I couldn't quite explain yet, the house seemed brighter whenever Ryan was there. Ryan's visits became part of the rhythm of the house before I even realized it. Some weeks he showed up almost every day after school. Other times a few days would pass without seeing him, but I always noticed the difference when he wasn't there. The hallway stayed quiet. Daniel stayed in his room alone. The energy in the house returned to the slow, predictable silence I had grown used to. At first, our conversations were brief and casual. A greeting when he walked through the door. A quick comment about homework or school. But over time those moments stretched a little longer. Sometimes Daniel would run upstairs to grab something while Ryan stayed behind in the kitchen with me. Other times they would both come down for snacks and Daniel would get distracted by his phone while Ryan continued talking. That it wasn't anything inappropriate. At least that's what I kept reminding myself. Just conversation. That he talked about school more openly than most teenagers did. The pressure of exams, the stress of choosing what to study in the future, the confusion that comes with trying to figure out life at such a young age. I listened the way any adult might listen to a teenager trying to make sense of things, but there was something different about the way he spoke to me. He didn't treat the conversation like a polite obligation. He actually seemed curious about my thoughts. One afternoon he asked what I had wanted to do when I was younger. The question caught me off guard. I couldn't remember the last time anyone asked me something like that. For a moment I hesitated, trying to think back to dreams I had nearly forgotten. I told him about interests I once had, about ideas I considered before life took me in a different direction. He listened quietly, leaning against the counter, nodding occasionally. The conversation stayed in my mind long after he left that day. That it wasn't the topic that lingered. It was the feeling of being heard. That realization made me uncomfortable, because it forced me to notice something about my life that I had been ignoring for a long time. Conversations like that rarely happened with my husband anymore. Our talks were usually practical: what needed to be fixed in the house, what bills were due, what time dinner would be ready. Ryan's visits continued, and with each passing week our interactions became slightly more natural. Sometimes he helped me carry grocery bags inside if he arrived while I was unloading the car. Other times he would stay in the kitchen talking while I finished preparing dinner before joining Daniel upstairs. The topics were still harmless. School stories, funny situations with friends, music he liked, movies the boys were watching. But there was an ease in those conversations that slowly started affecting me. He laughed easily. He told stories with enthusiasm. His perspective on the world carried that bright confidence people often lose as they grow older. I began noticing small things about him without meaning to. The way he spoke with his hands when explaining something. The way his expression changed when he got excited about an idea. The quick smile he gave when a joke landed well. Each observation felt innocent by itself. But together they created a strange awareness that I didn't quite understand. One evening the boys were watching something upstairs while I prepared dinner. Ryan came down alone to grab a drink. Instead of rushing back upstairs like usual, he stayed in the kitchen and started talking about a presentation he had to give at school. He seemed nervous about it. Worried he might mess up in front of the class. I reassured him the way any parent might reassure a teenager. I told him most people feel that way before speaking in front of others, that confidence usually grows with experience. He listened carefully, then smiled in relief as if my words genuinely helped. That moment should have been simple. Just a small exchange between an adult and a teenager seeking advice, but after he returned upstairs, I caught myself replaying the conversation in my mind while finishing dinner. That was the first time I noticed something unusual about my own thoughts. I was thinking about him long after the conversation ended. I brushed the feeling away quickly, telling myself I was overanalyzing something completely harmless. After all, he was Daniel's friend. A teenager who happened to spend time in our house. Nothing more. Still, a quiet awareness had started forming. Whenever the boys were downstairs, I found myself paying more attention to their conversations. Listening for Ryan's voice in particular. Sometimes he would include me in the discussion, asking my opinion about a movie they were debating or a topic they were arguing about. Those moments created a strange feeling of connection that I hadn't expected. I tried to stay careful. I kept reminding myself of the obvious reality of the situation. He was much younger. He belonged to my son's world, not mine, yet the emotional pull was subtle enough that it slipped past those logical reminders. Days passed, then weeks. The pattern repeated over and over. Friendly conversations, shared laughter, brief moments in the kitchen while the boys moved in and out of the house. Nothing inappropriate happened. Not even close. But something inside me had started shifting quietly. One night after everyone had gone to bed, I was lying awake staring at the ceiling when a realization crept into my mind. Earlier that afternoon Ryan hadn't come over like he usually did. Daniel had gone out instead. The house had stayed quiet all evening, and I had noticed. That thought bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Not because anything had happened between us, but because of the simple truth behind it. His absence had left a space in the house I didn't expect to feel. That was the moment I started asking myself a question I didn't like. Why was I thinking about him at all when he wasn't even there? After that realization, I started paying closer attention to my own behavior. Not in an obvious way, but in the quiet, reflective way people do when they sense something inside them is shifting. I told myself there was nothing wrong with being friendly to my son's friend. Adults did that all the time. But the truth was that my awareness of Ryan had grown sharper than it should have been. I noticed when he arrived at the house. I noticed when his voice echoed through the hallway while he and Daniel laughed upstairs. Even small details began standing out to me, like the sound of his footsteps coming down the stairs or the way his tone changed when he spoke to different people. None of it meant anything on the surface. But inside my mind, the awareness kept growing. At the same time, my marriage continued along the same quiet path it had been following for years. My husband remained busy with work, leaving early most mornings and often returning late in the evening. When we spoke, it was usually about schedules, groceries, or plans for the weekend. There was nothing hostile between us. Just distance. One afternoon I caught myself doing something that made me pause. Daniel had mentioned earlier that Ryan might come over later to work on a school project. Without thinking much about it, I found myself choosing a different shirt before starting dinner. The moment I realized what I was doing, I stopped. It wasn't a dramatic change. Just a small decision about clothing. But the thought behind it made me uncomfortable. I told myself it was coincidence. People changed clothes all the time for no particular reason. Still, the awareness lingered in the back of my mind. Ryan arrived later that evening with a stack of books under his arm. The boys went upstairs immediately, talking about the project they needed to finish. I tried to focus on normal tasks around the house, pushing away the strange tension I had created in my own thoughts. An hour later they came downstairs looking for snacks. Daniel grabbed a bag of chips and headed back toward the stairs while Ryan stayed behind for a moment to pour himself a drink. He started talking about the project they were working on, explaining how complicated one part of it had become. I listened casually, offering a few suggestions when he asked, but during the conversation, something felt slightly different. Not in his behavior exactly, but in the atmosphere between us. The pauses between sentences felt longer. Eye contact lingered a moment more than usual before either of us looked away. The conversation itself was harmless, yet the silence around it carried a strange weight. After he went back upstairs, I stood in the kitchen for a moment longer than necessary, trying to shake the feeling that something had shifted. Days continued passing, and those subtle moments started happening more often. Nothing obvious, nothing that anyone else would notice. Just small pauses, longer conversations, and an awareness that neither of us seemed to acknowledge out loud. Then one evening something happened that changed the situation completely. The boys had been working on another assignment upstairs when Daniel suddenly remembered he had promised to meet someone nearby. He rushed downstairs, grabbing his jacket while explaining that he would only be gone for a little while. Ryan stayed behind to finish part of the work. For the first time since he started coming to our house, he and I were alone for more than a few minutes. At first the situation felt completely normal. He sat at the dining table looking through notes while I continued cleaning the kitchen. After a few minutes he started talking about the assignment again, asking if I understood part of the topic they were researching. I joined him at the table and looked over the material he was reading. The discussion turned into a longer conversation about school, then gradually drifted into other subjects. He spoke about the pressure he felt trying to choose the right path for his future. About expectations from family, about the fear of making the wrong decision. The honesty in his voice surprised me. Teenagers usually hide that kind of vulnerability behind jokes or confidence, but he spoke openly, almost as if he trusted me with those thoughts. I listened carefully, offering encouragement the way any adult would. But as the conversation continued, the emotional tone between us deepened. There was a quiet sincerity in the room that felt different from our previous interactions. The kind of atmosphere that forms when two people speak honestly without distractions around them. At one point he looked at me thoughtfully and said something simple. He told me I was easy to talk to. The words were innocent, but the way he said them carried a warmth that settled heavily in my chest. For a moment neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward exactly. It was just full. In that quiet space I became painfully aware of the situation. The age difference. The fact that he was my son's friend. The invisible boundaries that existed for a reason. Nothing inappropriate happened. No physical gesture, no confession, nothing that crossed a visible line, yet the emotional reality was impossible to ignore. When Daniel eventually returned home, the moment ended instantly. Ryan packed his things and left shortly afterward, thanking me for the help with the assignment. But after the door closed behind him, I sat alone in the living room with a heavy feeling in my chest. because the truth had finally become clear. The connection between us had grown into something real, even if neither of us had spoken about it directly, and that realization forced me to confront a painful question. Had I already crossed a line that could never be undone, even if no one else knew it? Existed? After that evening, running into my neighbor stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like a quiet part of my routine. It never happened in a dramatic way. We didn't suddenly start spending hours together or planning conversations. It was always small moments, brief interactions that seemed ordinary on the surface but slowly became something I began to look forward to. Some mornings we crossed paths while leaving for work. Other times it happened in the evening when one of us stepped outside for fresh air. The conversations were never complicated. Just simple questions about how the day went or casual observations about the neighborhood, but there was a difference between those conversations and the ones I had at home. When my neighbor asked how I was doing, they actually listened to the answer. At home, most evenings had become predictable. My spouse usually arrived late, often looking distracted. Dinner felt more like a task than a shared moment. We would sit across from each other, sometimes exchanging a few sentences about work, but the conversations rarely lasted long. Eventually one of us would drift toward our phone or television, and silence would fill the room again. That I kept telling myself that relationships naturally settled into quieter rhythms over time. Passion fades, routines take over, and life becomes practical rather than exciting. That explanation made sense logically, but emotionally something still felt wrong. Meanwhile, the neighbors' friendliness never felt forced. They had a way of making ordinary conversations feel meaningful. One evening we ended up talking for nearly 20 minutes while standing outside near the driveway. It started with a simple comment about the weather but gradually turned into a discussion about work stress and the strange pressure adults carry without talking about it. At some point during the conversation, I admitted that work had been exhausting lately. I hadn't planned to say it out loud. It just slipped out naturally. Instead of giving the usual quick response people offer, my neighbor asked a few thoughtful questions. They didn't interrupt or rush the conversation. They simply listened. That small moment stayed with me longer than I expected. It had been a long time since anyone had seemed genuinely interested in how I was feeling. Over the next couple of weeks, the conversations continued to happen randomly. Sometimes they lasted only a minute or two. Other times they stretched longer without either of us noticing the time passing. The topics were always harmless: work, hobbies, small frustrations about daily life. Nothing personal enough to feel inappropriate. Still, I started noticing something uncomfortable about myself. Those short conversations were becoming the highlight of my day. I didn't want to admit it. The thought alone made me feel guilty. I was married, and nothing about my neighbor's kindness should have carried that kind of emotional weight. But the truth was simple. It felt good to talk to someone who seemed present. At home, the distance between my spouse and me kept growing. They had started keeping their phone with them constantly. Even during dinner it sat face down beside their plate. When messages arrived, they often glanced at the screen quickly before turning it away. It wasn't obvious enough to accuse them of anything, but it was noticeable. One night I asked casually why they had been working so late lately. The answer came quickly and without much detail. A big project. Extra responsibilities. Nothing unusual. The explanation sounded reasonable, yet something about the tone felt rehearsed. I didn't push the conversation further. Part of me didn't want to know more. As long as everything remained vague, I could keep believing the distance between us was temporary. A few days later, my neighbor and I ended up talking again while I was bringing groceries inside. They offered to help carry a couple of bags, and we walked toward the house together. During that short walk they mentioned something interesting. They said they'd noticed the neighborhood had become unusually quiet at night recently. Fewer people outside, fewer lights on. It was an innocent observation, but it reminded me how often my spouse had been coming home late. For a brief second, an uncomfortable thought crossed my mind. What if those late nights weren't really about work? I pushed the idea away immediately. Jumping to conclusions would only create unnecessary problems. Trust meant giving someone the benefit of the doubt, especially in a marriage. Still, the thought didn't disappear completely. Later that week, another small detail caught my attention. My spouse received a phone call while we were sitting in the living room. Instead of answering it normally, they stepped outside to take it. The call lasted only a few minutes, but when they returned they seemed slightly nervous. When I asked who it was, they answered quickly, "Just someone from work asking about a schedule change." Again, nothing suspicious on the surface, yet the uneasy feeling returned. Over the following days those feelings began stacking up. Each moment by itself seemed insignificant, but together they created a quiet tension I couldn't ignore anymore. Meanwhile, my neighbor continued to be kind in the same effortless way they always had been. One evening they brought over a small package that had been mistakenly delivered to their address. Another time they asked if I wanted to join them for a short walk around the block after dinner. The invitation surprised me, but it didn't feel inappropriate. It felt like something neighbors naturally did. During that walk we talked about ordinary things again. But toward the end of the conversation they said something unexpected. They mentioned that I seemed a little stressed lately. The comment caught me off guard. I hadn't realized it was that noticeable. For a moment I considered brushing it off, but instead I admitted that things at home had been feeling distant lately. I didn't go into detail. I just said the atmosphere had changed and I couldn't quite explain why. Neighbor didn't try to analyze the situation or give dramatic advice. They simply said that sometimes people notice changes before they understand them. Then they added something that lingered in my mind long after the conversation ended. They said that when something feels different for a long time, there's usually a reason behind it. At the time I didn't realize how close that quiet observation was to the truth, because only a few days later, a small piece of information would surface. Something so simple, yet so unsettling, that it would make me question everything I believed about my marriage.